Welcome, everybody, from wherever you're joining us. I assume there will be not only people from around Europe, but also some participants from the United States and from Asia also. Happy to have you, and you're in for an exciting webinar. My name is Reinhard Bütikofer. I'm your host today. I'm a member of the European Parliament and chair of the European Parliament's China delegation. And today I have the honor of presenting four very famous academics and think tankers to discuss with them and to learn from them about different angles looking at Taiwan policy and the future of Taiwan's democracy. We're joined by Bonnie Glaser from Washington, who is just the new director of the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, who has been working for more than 30 years on issues in the broad intersection of Asia-Pacific geopolitics and US policy, who's been counseling departments of defense and state, who's been working with still is working with the Lowy Institute in Sydney, with the Pacific Forum and many other functions. Great to have you, Bonnie. Thanks for joining us. Then we will hear in second place, we will hear Gudrun Wacker from Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik from Berlin. Gudrun is senior fellow there in the Asia division. Since 2018, she's also the EU representative at the ASEAN Regional Forum Expert and Eminent Persons. She's been a researcher at the Federal Institute for Russian East European International Studies, and she's been at the Department for Chinese and Korean Studies at the University of Tübingen before, and then in third place, we have Mathieu Duchâtel from Paris. Mathieu is the director of the Asia program at Institut Montaigne, has been in that role since January 2019. Before that, he was senior policy fellow and deputy director of the Asia and China program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. He has spent 9 years studying in Shanghai, Taipei, and Beijing. Also welcome to you, Mathieu. Thanks for joining. And last but certainly not least, we have Sven Biskup from Brussels. Sven currently serves as the director of the Europe in the World program at the Egmont Royal Institute for International Relations in Brussels, which he joined in 2002. He's also a professor at Ghent University, and his research and teaching focus is on the strategies of the European Union, NATO, and their member states. And he also regularly lectures at the EU's European Security and Defense College. And I could go on, but I'm sure you will be happy that we managed to put this great panel together. And after their presentations, 10 minutes each, you will be invited to join us for the conversation to put your questions, your remarks, but we'll come to that in a short while. Without much further ado, I want to turn now to our experts, and I invite you to take the floor first. Bonnie, it's yours.
Thank you so much for including me in this important webinar on a very crucial topic that is receiving a great deal of attention, I think, around the world. And the focus of attention on Taiwan most recently has largely been on the question of whether and when China might use force to achieve unification. Now, while that question is important, I believe it is not really the most pressing issue. In fact, what is really most pressing is gray zone threats. And gray zone threats are actions that remain beneath the threshold that would justify a military response. They're very difficult for democracies to respond to, and China's gray zone toolbox has been growing. It includes diplomatic and economic information, cyber, and also military tools. Military tools intended to coerce, not actual use of force. For China, Taiwan is first and foremost a political problem, not a military problem. And China has long been engaged in psychological warfare and intimidation against Taiwan. The gray zone tactics are part of a broader strategy aimed at the goals of deterring independence and wearing down the confidence of the Taiwanese people in their government's ability to protect its democracy, so that ultimately Taiwan will succumb to that pressure from China and negotiate the terms of unification. So my point here is that not enough attention is being paid to these threats. And this is where the United States and Europe can work both separately and together, I think, to strengthen Taiwan's democracy. So if we look, for example, at the diplomatic realm, where Beijing is pressuring many countries around the world to prevent Taiwan from participating in any of the UN agencies. This, of course, particularly is the World Health Organization, important today as so many countries are still facing so many cases of the crisis of the pandemic. Taiwan has been one of the most successful in the world of combating this and controlling the spread of COVID-19. And China has, of course, kept Taiwan out of the World Health Organization. It has also poached several of Taiwan's diplomatic allies and partners, now down to 15. And in the economic realm, we've recently seen where China has applied economic coercion for more than 10 years against many countries, including some in Europe. Norway and Sweden come to mind, but Taiwan has been the target recently. China has banned the import of pineapples from Taiwan. It, of course, has also banned in recent years or at least curb the ability of mainland tourists to go to Taiwan. So those are examples of economic gray zone threats. They've also poached talent, engineers that come from Taiwan, and stealing intellectual property, of course. The military pressure, we all know that's what's in the news. China is operating fighters and bombers and electronic warfare and reconnaissance aircraft in Taiwan's air defense identification zone. Some of these aircraft are circumnavigating Taiwan. They have naval ships, including aircraft carriers. They're sailing in the strait, etc. So I want to just spend a little bit of time talking about what we can do. Economics is really inseparable from security. And I think that we should be responding by, in part, helping Taiwan to broaden its economic markets. So we can help to purchase perhaps even some of the a banned product. You may have seen on Twitter the other day, former Prime Minister Abe was shown holding a Taiwanese pineapple. So that's an example of something that we can do. That depends, of course, the extent of the impact on Taiwan. It may not necessarily replace economic purchases, although we can try to do that as well, but it's a signal of support for Taiwan's democracy. We certainly should be condemning the exercise of economic coercion. And I think that this is an area where the US and Europe can work together. As a coalition of countries, we can seek to impose costs on China as well as protect our shared interests. Perhaps in a longer term solution is to work through the World Trade Organization and to update the WTO to deal with this kind of economic coercion. I think Europe and the United States should be negotiating trade agreements with Taiwan. Taiwan's a member of the WTO. It has a right to sign trade agreements. In the case of my country, I think we should be negotiating a bilateral free trade agreement with Taiwan, and we should begin by resuming what we call the TIFA talks, the Trade Investment Framework Agreement talks, which have not taken place since the Obama administration. I hope that Europe can think about negotiating an investment treaty with Taiwan. I think there have been some that have advocated this in the past. In the area of diplomacy, I think collective statements send very strong signals. So the group of 7, perhaps the D10, other mechanisms, we can make statements in support of Taiwan's participation in the WHO and other UN agencies. We can use creative means, such as some of you may be familiar with what we call the Global Cooperation Training Framework that the US started with Taiwan. Now Japan is a full partner. These are workshops that enable Taiwan to share its expertise with representatives from other countries and earn dignity and respect on the world stage. It's my understanding, I think the UK recently sponsored a workshop, Sweden has sponsored a workshop. This is issues like media literacy and global health, things like that. In the military realm, we can and should condemn China's almost daily incursions into Taiwan's ADIZ. For those countries that have naval capabilities, I believe they should be considering sailing through the Taiwan Strait periodically. These are international waters. Many countries do sail through them. I think Canada did so recently. And then finally, I would highlight democracy networking. We should be working to integrate Taiwan into evolving networks of like-minded countries that are really designed to strengthen the resilience of democracies. So in this area, I think the Biden administration's plan to hold a US summit for democracy is a great opportunity. China has already condemned the possibility of including Taiwan, but my expectation is that there will be some way that Taiwan would and should join this very important meeting when it takes place. And then finally, of course, last but not least, parliamentary exchanges. And I know that there are some underway. We have them with Congress. You certainly have them with the EU Parliament. But I think that there's more that we can do to strengthen the ties between the parliaments. So I'll stop there. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Bonnie. That was great. You gave us a lot of food for thought, and you identified some strategies that we might call gray zone support to counter the gray zone threats. And I move now on immediately to our next speaker, Gudrun Wacker. Please tell us how it all looks from Berlin.
Okay, thank you, Reinhard. And I will repeat some of the suggestions that Bonnie made because, you know, this is really straightforward, but I thought I'd start with the present German position on Taiwan. And this is somewhat sobering because it hasn't changed. It's one China policy, which does not mean that Taiwan is a part of the PRC, but it's a one China policy. We want to maintain the status quo, which means no change of the status quo unless it's consensus on both sides of the strait. But we also see growing pressure from the Chinese embassy. They are observing every tiny event, everything where Taiwan is involved. And there is something I would call, in translating a German expression, anticipatory obedience. There are two examples I want to bring up here. One is that there is no flag of the Republic of China on the website of the Foreign Ministry, the German Foreign Ministry. There is Taiwan, but then the spot where the flag should be is empty. And this is different from other non-state entities like Palestine, and it made it to the media in Taiwan, and there was a very lame explanation on the side of the German Foreign Ministry. The second I want to raise is a petition to the German Parliament by a retired marine biologist who had visited Taiwan. And the petition was that the parliament should ask the German government to recognize Taiwan. Now, I'm not talking about the outcome of the petition, but the fact that they tried to keep this under the carpet. They didn't want to make public that this petition is there, and it only because the retired marine biologist had the 50,000 signatures to bring this petition forward. I think he went through the green fraction in the German Bundestag, and then it was made public, and it was also a public event, the hearings on this petition. So you see that Germany is very, very cautious. Also, because we recently issued these Indo-Pacific guidelines, if you search the text, Taiwan is not there, and neither is it in the Council conclusions that were published last week. Taiwan is simply not mentioned, maybe owed to the fact that, you know, we try to signal to China that this is an inclusive approach. But on the other hand, on the website of the Foreign Ministry, Taiwan is called a value partner. This is basically the first sentence. And the economic, cultural, and scientific relations are mentioned as very lively. There are 300 German companies in Taiwan, and there are 200 university partnerships, which is quite substantial, I have to say. And it's also mentioned that Germany supports at least observer status for Taiwan in international organizations like the World Health Organization and the Civil Aviation Organization. So I would say we could be more outspoken on this, and we could coordinate better on this support for international organization, but at least it's explicitly there. So basically this means that there are very intense exchanges and relations with Taiwan in every field that is not considered a sovereignty related area. Is there any new thinking in Germany? I think the official thinking in Germany is that we should fill the room of maneuver we have with as much life as possible. So the exchanges and relations should be intensified, especially in the economic field, to create stakeholders on both sides, which make the interest higher on the German side to protect or try to help protect the democracy in Taiwan. There is one specific thing in the German system, because we are a federal system. One of the efforts that are made is educating the federal states and the municipalities about what one China policy means, so that they are able to refute the Chinese interpretation of, you know, one China policy or the one China principles, as they would call it. So there is a certain leeway at the local level, but it also entails certain risks. I think Reinhard and some other people last year published an op-ed making some suggestions where, you know, European countries could go forward. I think a dialogue with the highest offices in Taiwan, this is not a place where this German government wants to go. But we have to see, there will be elections, general elections in September, and we will see whether there will be a rethinking under the next German government. My last part are just some unstructured thoughts and questions. The first question is whether it's better for the stability of Taiwan and safety of Taiwan if we give it more visibility or less. Sometimes I'm not sure whether, you know, this discrete approach is always the best. And I think what you just said, Bonnie, probably it should become a regular matter to raise the gray zone activities when we talk to the Chinese, because we raise Hong Kong all the time, we raise Xinjiang all the time, we should raise Taiwan all the time, and we have to observe very closely the activities that are going on to be able to have a good argument. And within the One China policy, I think if we want to diversify our relations in the region, as we say in the Indo-Pacific guidelines, and deepen our partnership and lower our dependency on China, we should help and support Taiwan to do the same, which basically goes in the direction of what Bonnie said. The question whether there could be something like negotiations about investment treaty with Taiwan. This is not a German, it's not for Germany to decide, but I think if the comprehensive agreement on investment with China does go forward, we have a good argument to say, you know, now we will start to look into the possibility of upgrading the investment relationship with Taiwan. I think that Germany could co-host one of the Global Cooperation and Training Framework workshops. Other European member states have done so. I don't know whether they're open to the idea, but this should be a no-brainer, I would say, because the topics within this program are very much central to our thinking as well. And finally, I stop with a warning. What we should not do is sort of an ostrich approach where we put our head in the sand on the risks that are there in the region, and this includes more Taiwan scenarios, thinking through what we would do and how we can prevent certain scenarios from coming about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gudrun. And that is now time to give the floor to our third speaker, Mathieu, please. Your view from Paris.
Thank you very much, Reinhard, for inviting me and also for providing some guiding questions which help me frame what I'm going to say now. You know, the first question is to what extent the Taiwan debate has changed in the EU in the last 10 years. And I think that the time frame that is more relevant here is perhaps the past 2 years rather than the past 10 years. And there are intangible elements and also tangible elements to the things that matter the most. And I would just like to list the 4 trends that I think matter the most when it comes to the Taiwan debate in the EU today. And first, the image of Taiwan has really benefited from the impeccable management of the COVID-19 crisis. And it matters here because it's an example of successful democratic governance. It shows that success is possible with transparency. I think transparency was an enormous asset in the way Taiwan managed the COVID-19 crisis, but also with checks and balances. And I'm meaning here media and also democratic scrutiny, pressure from the opposition. All these things were important. And of course, the success of Taiwan by comparison to the success of Australia and New Zealand was really put in the spotlight in contrast to the Chinese model. When I recollect the media coverage regarding Taiwan at the height of the first wave of infections in Western Europe, and of course there has been some mind-boggling media reporting here and there that argued that Taiwan was able to manage the pandemic because it was an authoritarian democracy. That's the sort of things you heard here and there, and it was part of the discussion because of the practice of individual quarantine. But I think that in the minds of many, and in terms of progress for Taiwan's image, the COVID-19 crisis and Taiwan's success has been an enormous opportunity, and it helped puts Taiwan in the minds of people as a successful democratic governance example. The second element, or the second trend, is the awareness that there is a possibility of a serious cross-strait crisis. And I think that the awareness in Europe is making some progress in the context, of course, of PLA Air Force operations within Taiwan's air defense identification zone, and in the context of the discussion mentioned by both Bonnie and Gudrun regarding gray zone operations. And I don't think that we have an answer to the question, but I think that the question is in the minds of many in the policy making circles, how to respond to gray zone operations. The third point, I think, is that unfortunately for Taiwan, those image gains have not had any impact on the EU's approach regarding trade and investment relations with Taiwan. There is no political push inside the EU for a bilateral investment agreement with Taiwan for many reasons, including reasons linked to the nature of the investment relationship between the EU and Taiwan. But I think that the previous thinking before the signing of CAI, that CAI would open the way to negotiating a bilateral investment agreement with Taiwan, has in fact to a large degree vanished in the air. And in fact, one can go even further. When you look at the Commission's trade policy review, published earlier this year in February, Taiwan is no longer there. So, I would argue that Europe overall at the EU level remains cold and cautious to the idea of providing a political push to deepening interactions with Taiwan. And this goes in the same direction as Gudrun's point on the Indo-Pacific. And then there's the fourth element, which I think deserves some attention. It's the Taiwan discussion in the context of the global semiconductor shortage, which has put Taiwan in the spotlight. The US, Japan, Europe, Australia, all are discussing supply chain security in the context of COVID-19 disruptions. But semiconductors have a very special status in this discussion, and Taiwan is very central, of course, given Taiwan's leadership as a contract foundry. One aspect of this is the political requests going through the Taiwan's economy ministry to rearrange production lines so that the automotive, the access of the automotive industry to semiconductors could be eased, and that came from Germany. But the other aspect is the ongoing discussion at the EU level, started by the Commission, which in fact is an intra-European debate, as we are talking, regarding the need for Europe to have an advanced foundry on European soil. I think we can perhaps discuss this more during the discussion. I just make 2 points here regarding the EU and TSMC, keeping in mind that the meeting between Thierry Breton, the Commissioner for Industry, and TSMC Europe is taking place tomorrow. I mean, this is an incredibly ambitious idea to have TSMC invest in an advanced foundry in Europe. When you think that the total amount or the total stock of Taiwan's investment in the EU was less than 4 billion euros in 2018, we are talking here of investment levels above 10 billion euros, if you look at the example of TSMC investing in the US. And Taiwan finds itself at the exact center of the intra-European discussion regarding industrial policy, which is a very interesting development. And my second point is that I could list all the reasons why TSMC currently does not really show interest in investing in Europe at this stage. And in fact, it reflects the larger story of Taiwanese corporate actors having other priorities than Europe. But I think that this discussion is still there. And it's perhaps only the beginning if you want to be optimistic. So overall, on the European debates, I think that interestingly, in the past 2 years, Taiwan has been present in the European discussions, not only for the security equation in the Taiwan Straits, cross-strait relations, but for other reasons that are linked to Taiwan's key strengths. And I'm thinking, of course, of Taiwan as a successful public health governance model, but also Taiwan as a technology success story. And this, I think, is a change which is not fully translated in policy terms, but a change in the debate. And secondly, you asked me about Paris and how Paris does assess the Taiwan situation. Let me also make a couple of points here. I think that there is an increase of tensions in the Taiwan Straits. It's a fact, and it affects France to some extent because of some distinctive elements in the Franco-Taiwanese relationship, which makes this relationship kind of unique in the broader picture of Taiwan's relations with European states. I really like the formula from 1964 to 1994 to describe the relationship between France and Taiwan. In 1964, when de Gaulle established relations with the PRC, and he broke not only ranks with the transatlantic, with the US, but with his ally during the Second World War, Chiang Kai-shek. And France did not take the initiative at this time to break relations with the ROC. Taiwan's Chiang Kai-shek did it at the time, of course. Some see that as a missed opportunity for a two-China solution. We will not rewrite history, but it's part of the big picture today. And 1994, very interesting as well, because of the joint Franco-Chinese communique, in which after two large arms sales by France to Taiwan, the Lafayette frigates in 1991 and the Mirage fighter jets in 1992, and the subsequent Chinese decision to sanction France, closing the consulate in Guangzhou, but also expelling French companies from the tender to build the subway in Guangzhou. Also, it kind of echoes some very contemporary developments in China's relations with the West. At the time, France was sanctioned when the US was selling the F-16 fighter jets almost at the same time. So there's always a kind of choice to target the weaker party in the Chinese approach. But 1994, end of the problem in France-China relations, with the communique in which France recognizes the PRC government as the sole government of China and Taiwan as an integral part of the Chinese territory. That's the language of the communique. And the French government also promises not to let French companies participate in the armament of Taiwan. That's 1994. And we learned afterwards that there was an annex limiting the French engagement to offensive equipment. And I'm mentioning this because this history has consequences. One, France is slightly more cautious than other European states, especially in the north, when it comes to political contacts with Taiwan today, or visible political contacts, such as hosting ministers in Paris. The foreign minister has been, has been in Denmark. He's not been to many other European countries, but France is definitely not one of them. Perhaps because of that history as well, and because of the cautiousness of France, we have to deal now with an initiative by the French embassy to go against parliamentary exchanges between France and Taiwan, which have been recently described by the Chinese ambassador to France as a violation of the One China principle and the wrong signal to send to the pro-independence forces in Taiwan. So, that kind of colors the politics of France-Taiwan relations. And the second consequence of this history is that France still has a low-key defense relationship with Taiwan as a follow-up to the contract signed in the early 1990s, and a relationship that has also been put in the spotlight by the Chinese embassy to France last year, who protested the sale of a decoy system for the Lafayette frigates that was in May last year, calling France to call the contract, to cancel the contract. So you see, my point here is that the Franco-Taiwanese relationship has a good basis of people-to-people contact and cultural exchanges. It also does have a political and security dimension, which is being put under growing pressure these days.
Mathieu, can I give you a 1-minute warning?
Sure. I'll add a third element here. It was mentioned by others: naval transits in the Taiwan Straits. this was not political until it became so. And that was in March 2019, when there was, in fact, we don't know all the details, but a problem between the French frigate transiting through the Taiwan Straits and the Chinese Navy, which led to the disinvitation of the French Navy from a naval event in China. So France was part of the politicization of the transits through the Taiwan Strait by the Chinese side. My conclusion here, I think the priority number one, and I mean that it's important to expand the scope and the depth of interaction with Taiwan, but it's also very important to stand our ground on these three issues.
Thank you very much. And finally, Sven, it's now your turn. Please give us your insights.
Thank you, Reinhard. As they say, everything has been said, but not yet by everybody, so we'll have a go. Perhaps for the sake of transparency, I should state up front that my husband is Taiwanese. So apart from thinking about Taiwan as an academic, I also have a personal attachment to the island. I just wanted to make three relatively quick points. One, I think that the reason why especially Europeans feel somehow attached to Taiwan is because it's a democracy. And indeed, going there now very often, that's what I realized. It's a very real, vibrant democracy. Also the first one in Asia, by the way, to introduce gay marriage. So it's an example in many ways. And Europeans, I think, automatically feel emotionally linked to any other democracy. I fear that the EU is not in a position to actively democratize other countries, but where a place that is democratic, I think it is our moral duty, but it's also in our interest to help safeguard that democracy. So I think in the first instance, it is because Taiwan is democratic that we feel attached to it. I sometimes joke that had Taiwan not become democratic, we might have dropped it a long time ago, as after the end of the Cold War, during which we supported many dictators as long as they were anti-communist. Then when the Cold War ended and we no longer needed them, we dropped them. But Taiwan became a democracy, and so it deserves, in that sense, our full support to maintain that level of democracy. However, I think slowly, gradually, as the Brussels bubble is beginning to think in more strategic and geopolitical terms, that dimension has also entered the Taiwan debate. If force were used to change the status quo, that of course would then also create suspicion. I think this is something that China should really realize. Once you have used force once, you will never be trusted again. Right? It's just like Mr. Putin having invaded Ukraine. He will always be suspected now of being willing to try force and use force in another case. So if China were to use force to change the status quo, that of course would mean that China could never be trusted again not to use force against another country in Asia. And then who would be the next target? So I think that should perhaps also influence the European debate a bit more. The second quick point that I wanted to make is that those who want to help Taiwan should do so for the sake of Taiwan. With that, I mean we should be careful not to instrumentalize Taiwan for our own purposes. I think a lot of this happened, to be honest, during the Trump administration. That's, of course, very easy. You use Taiwan as a pawn against Beijing. If it works, it works, it's fine. If it doesn't work, Taiwan pays the price. That is a little bit too dangerous. I think also Taipei itself should sometimes be a bit more careful in going along with that and think carefully about the costs and benefits of certain courses of actions. So, but we as EU should definitely be very careful about this, that we do not, don't do anything that Taiwanese themselves are not actually asking for. That would be a good line of conduct, I think. And two, make sure that by supporting Taiwan, that you don't somehow end up making things worse. In the end, I think for the time being, the goal that the EU can hope for is the status quo. And then thirdly, and I'll be brief because most of the items have already been covered by the other colleagues. What could the EU do concretely? One, I think, is indeed the bilateral investment agreement that would be in the interest of both. Two is that I think in certain specific sectors, step up cooperation between individual companies or group of companies. And three is definitely to strongly support Taiwanese membership of specific international organizations. And I'm thinking specifically of the World Health Organization. As has been said, Taiwan is one of the very few places on earth that did not have to lock down its society and its economy. I can tell you, for my husband sitting here in Brussels, confined to our apartment, it was painful to see the images of Taiwan where life just went on. So Taiwan, I mean, we can really, everybody can learn from Taiwan. It would be silly to exclude it from WHO membership. I was in Taiwan when I first heard of the coronavirus, perhaps more early than many in Europe, because we spent our Christmas holiday 2019 there. So very early in January 2020, just before returning home, the Taiwanese news reported on the outbreak of a new unknown virus in Wuhan. My reaction was, of course, yeah, well, what should we care about it? As I think many of us continue to think for too long a time. My husband's reaction actually immediately was, that is something to be very careful about. And so this shows you that how to say, even he, and he's not a health professional, had that very clearly on his mind. And so clearly this is something ingrained in the system in Taiwan, how to deal with such kind of pandemics. And I think there are other, let's say, more technical international organizations and frameworks in which Taiwanese membership ought to be possible and encouraged without risking undue political complications. So I think there the EU has a couple of rather concrete courses of action that it could pursue right now if it wants to. Thank you very much, Reinhard, for the invitation.
Thank you also, Sven. That concludes our introductory round of remarks, and we're about now to also engage participants who've been listening in. I would want to give Bonnie the floor first, because she has to leave us a bit early because she has to testify in the Congress. And I would want to raise a few of the issues with you, and we'll later also put the questions to the other colleagues, Bonnie, and maybe add a few of my own questions. I liked very much Gudrun's prescription of possible criteria for actions that we could take by arguing that we should create stakeholdership. I like that because it would make us aware that this is not somebody else's concern, that this is part of our own concern. And in that context, in an op-ed that we published last October, we proposed, for instance, to consider putting up a Taiwan-based TV program, a Mandarin language TV program around Europe to give Taiwan some presence and to help also open the minds of so many people for the perspectives from Taiwan. What would you say about such an idea? Is it crazy? Is it overly ambitious, or would it make any sense? And then Mathieu raised the issue of semiconductor industry and how that might provide possibly a new angle for a stronger European involvement, where we do not just see Taiwan as the recipient of support from our side, but where we learn how strongly Taiwan can help us also beyond just the examples that they've been setting with regard to the pandemic management. So maybe you would want to pick that up. And certainly the Biden administration has been willing to take steps to widen the scope for exchange with Taiwan. He invited the representative of Taiwan to the inauguration for the first time ever. So there is some timidity around Europe. What's your comment there? I mean, this falls into same basket as Gudrun's question about more visibility or less visibility. What is it? Where would you want to go? And then a question from one of our listeners from Taiwan, obviously, asks for advice for Taiwan citizens how to resist China's disinformation. So whatever else you want to touch upon, Bonnie, please take the liberty to make your own remarks.
Well, thank you so much, Reinhard, and I am afraid I will have to be very brief since I have to go testify. But let me say, I think Gudrun's idea is terrific, but I think we should decide which issues we want to work with Taiwan on quietly, which ones need to be worked on more publicly. So this should be issue specific. And the coalitions may differ. Those countries that have navies or maybe more willing to actually sail through the strait, for example, or are willing to work with Taiwan in the global cooperation training framework. We can't think about just having one coalition. I think we're just going to need several depending on what the issue is. Countries are going to have different levels of comfort in terms of what they're willing to do together with either just Europeans and Americans or including Taiwan. So, but I think when it comes to making collective statements, that's something that we should be able to do as well as unilateral ones. On the issue of Biden administration has recently announced that it has revised the contact guidance with Taiwan, which has never been made public, but now has been revised. The Trump administration had eliminated these guidelines as to what level and on what occasion American officials could meet with officials from Taiwan. But essentially, I would characterize it as saying that the Biden administration is now encouraging US officials to meet with their Taiwan counterparts around the world. But there will be some limitations. And Gudrun, you mentioned restrictions on displaying the flag, and that is very much true in the United States. This is a symbol of sovereignty. We only recognize the PRC as the legal representative of China in the international community. The United States does not recognize Taiwan's claim to sovereignty. We claim this is unsettled. It's left over from history. It's ambiguous. And so there won't be any usage of flags. And then I would say in the area of supply chains, I think Matthew's made some very interesting points. I think there will be limits on how many fab plants TSMC is going to build in other countries. They're going to set up a research center, as I understand it, in Japan, and one fab plant in Arizona. The most advanced manufacturing that TSMC is doing will be in southern Taiwan. And so this is going to be the 4-nanometer chips that are going to be produced. And they will not be produced outside of Taiwan. I don't think we should see the fact that TSMC is mainly in Taiwan as a risk. We should see it as a member of a network of like-minded democracies that we should knit together to protect supply chains, make them more resilient. So I'm not sure that we actually have to diversify where they are producing them. That's ultimately that's a company decision. It's not, it is a decision that's based in part on profit. And I can tell you that it costs about 30% more to produce chips in the United States than in Taiwan. And the United States basically has to subsidize that production in the United States in order to have the plant. So that was a decision that was, I understand, basically made during the Trump administration. But I think it will go forward, but maybe not completely finalized. So I'm afraid I'm going to have to drop off. I'm so pleased to have been included in this discussion about Taiwan. And I'm sure our European friends will continue this very important conversation. I'll go back and watch it online later since it's being recorded. Thank you again, Reinhard.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. It's been a pleasure having you. And we'll continue this contact because as everybody has said from the European side, the agenda is picking up and there's more attention to this. Taiwan used not to be on our radar screen, now it is. So thanks again for joining and help for that conversation, and all the best to you. With that, I turn back to our European panelists, and I will read some of the questions to you and ask you to pick them up. One question is from a participant with a Polish name. Question to the European panelists: how do you assess the possibility of opening negotiation on EU-Taiwan bilateral investment agreement in the near future? What if the EU-China comprehensive agreement on investment would not be ratified? In such case, will there be any possibility to go ahead with the negotiations with Taiwan? Then an anonymous participant asks, dear MEP and dear distinguished panelists, where has the more reserved attitude of the EU come from overall? Then somebody asked again about the investment agreement. Can we be more creative in pursuing that goal? And someone asks about, do you have any advice for the people on the island on what we can do from the inside to stabilize our democracy and resist Chinese disinformation? And from the chat, there are also a couple, and I'll just sort of summarize them to you. How has Taiwanese society and Taiwan's political class been perceiving the latest moves from China and other actors? Is there a consensus building up on responses and scenarios? Sven Biskup has shared a link with more information. How does panelists reflect on the fact that PRC has an FTA with Taiwan, but EU does not believe it could without upsetting the One China policy? There was a question from Hosuk. And then, should the EU extend its military presence in the Indo-Pacific? If yes, how? Those were the questions, and I just wanted to raise one point from a EU-Taiwan perspective, positive development. Just recently, Lithuania announced that they not only are breaking rank with the 17+1, but that they're also pursuing the goal of setting up an office in Taiwan pretty soon. So there is one EU member country which is proactively doing something on a national level to address some of the issues we've been discussing. I would go by reverse order and ask you first, Sven, to pick up some of the questions that you like best, and then everybody else to follow suit.
All right, thank you, Reinhard. 3 sentences. One, I would not link a prospective bilateral investment treaty with Taiwan to the KAI. I would rather just do it and make it clear to China that we do not see them as interlinked, and that indeed China should demonstrate that it too wants the KAI. I think we should still ratify it, but on the precondition that we build in binding and verifiable mechanisms that ensure that no products of human rights violations enter our market. That is the red line. 2, the sort of very general question, why is the EU so reserved? Well, I think in a way the EU is still finding its way in power politics. I think we have been forever a global economic player. But in a way, the strategic culture of the EU was forged in the 90s when we thought everything was improving, was changing for the better. The world was democratizing and respecting human rights, and now we find ourselves in a world of great power rivalry. And I think we're still adapting. It has changed a lot. The word interest is no longer considered a dirty word in Brussels as it was for a while, but I think it will be a while still before we change. And finally, maybe since I deal a lot in my own work with defense, the question: should the EU extend its military presence in the Indo-Pacific? If yes, how? I mean, I would say yes to a degree. For sure, we should do this as EU. And coordinate what individual member states now do in the Indo-Pacific. But I think, I mean, obviously we have no great grand fleet to deploy there. And so in purely military terms, it doesn't mean much what we do to add one or the other European ship to the American fleet. So I would rather say we should see any European maritime presence there as a presence in its own right, not just a small add-on to the American presence, and link it clearly to specific diplomatic objectives. And then I think it can have an added value to make sure that we too are present and support our positions in all dimensions of power, economic, political, but also military. Thank you.
Thank you, Sven. Mathieu, please.
Okay, let me also pick up a few, and starting with the investment agreement between the EU and Taiwan. I think there are reasons to be rather pessimistic on the short term, but it's important to know the reasons why, to identify, what are the roadblocks. And I think that the first one is, the assessment in many parts of decision-making circles that moving ahead with a bilateral investment agreement with Taiwan would come with cost, which is a kind of anticipation of what might be the outcome with no certainty. I would tend to think that the timing now is perhaps, in fact, more sensitive than it could have been years ago, but that's part of the equation. Number two, I think that there is no critical political push, political mass in support of a push for moving ahead with such a negotiation today. And in fact, I think that the argument that is often, put forward by DG Trade, the fact that there is no need for such an agreement when you look at it from the perspective of business interest and investment relations between the EU and Taiwan, because of the asymmetry in the investment relationship. The stocks, I mentioned the numbers for Taiwanese investment in Europe by 2018, it's less than 4 billion. The European stock in Taiwan was 20 billion at the same time. The EU is the #1 investor in Taiwan. But as a result, and because the Europeans feel good legal protection in the Taiwanese investment environment, the need is not highly pressing from a pure European investment perspective. And I think that Gudrun's idea of stakeholding is really interesting there, because part of this is about also the substance of the investment relationship. And we can observe the EU delegation to Taiwan really trying to connect the discussion that takes place on supply chain security to a kind of attempt to welcome Taiwanese investors to come to Europe. And in fact, this discussion is not that easy. I have attended some dialogues between the EU and Taiwan on that particular issue. It's very interesting that on the Taiwanese side, the focus is very much on Europe as a partner for R&D and attracting Europe to invest more in Taiwan, rather than encouraging Taiwanese companies to set up foot in Europe. So these are, if you kind of deconstruct a little bit the obstacles, I think that these three stand out. Number two issue, military presence in the Indo-Pacific. I would personally be satisfied with the conclusions of the Council regarding the Indo-Pacific, because what I think is needed from the EU on that particular issue is a political endorsement for the states that do sail, let's say in East Asia, through the South China Sea, through the Taiwan Strait. The endorsement is general. It's not about sailing through the Taiwan Strait, because the issue is not, I should not say not yet, but it's not sufficiently politicized currently, and that's for the best. But this political endorsement is what I think we should expect from the EU. The naval presence is about action taken by member states. There was another question from Yannick Rangeau regarding semiconductors, which you did not read. So does that mean that I can...
No, you answer it. I didn't see it.
Okay. Asking about semiconductors and the demands in Europe, and in particular the demands of the auto industry. And he is totally right that the automotive industry does not need semiconductors etched at 7 nanometers, and in fact the 7 nanometer threshold is very important for the semiconductor industry, but the applications of semiconductors at 7 nanometers are entirely for the, let's call it the pure digital economy, smartphones, iPhones, etc. Automotive are fine with 28, even 55, 70, 90. So that's not an issue of having access to high-end semiconductors at this stage for the automotive industry. So the questions you ask regarding whether it would be possible to alleviate the chip shortage by at least building middle and lower end chip production plants in Europe, indeed. And I think that the Europeans, foundry players are also thinking in terms of increasing capacity. But what you see as well, ironically, is the huge investment by TSMC in China, announced, I think, last week, to expand, in fact, TSMC's fab capacity in Nanjing. And it's an investment of, I think, if I remember correctly, $2.8 billion. And it leads to a hard truth. I think the problem of the automotive industry is, in fact, the problem of access of supplies is going to find solutions in a cross-strait semiconductors rapprochement. So it's kind of the automotive industry is the depoliticized element of the geopolitics of semiconductors. Of course, if you look at the digital industry, the military end users, etc., it's a highly politicized and highly securitized industry. But I think the automotive sector is not going to prove to be the good element to create or to provide opportunities for Taiwanese companies to produce semiconductors in Europe. I should stop here.
Okay, Gudrun, the same questions for you.
Okay, let me start with the investment treaty. I just want to add one point to the obstacles that Mathieu raised, and I agree that at the moment there is little political will in the member states to push forward on this. But there is also the question of the capacity of the Commission, because with this Indo-Pacific Council conclusions, which has a very clear list of, which FTAs are negotiated right now and which countries are sort of next down the line, you can ask what capacity does the Commission have to negotiate an additional one. And so I would also agree that this is not the highest priority. On the military presence, I think EU endorsement would be good. It will be a decision of the member states. But what I hope is that we will see more coordinated approaches. I mean, Germany says they try to coordinate the, sending the frigate with France and also with the UK, but it didn't work. But this go it alone is probably not the way to go. And I say UK, I really hope that there will also be a possibility to coordinate these activities with Great Britain in the future. I know that when they send their aircraft carrier, I think there will be some Dutch, now a Danish participation in that. Maybe, this will develop in something like a European effort in the future. I had hoped that both of you, since you're married to people from Taiwan, would take up the question what the mood is in Taiwan. Because I haven't been there for a while and I haven't looked at public opinion polls, but I remember that Bonnie, together with Richard Haas and, what's his first name anyway, and Richard Bush, they wrote an op-ed.
Ryan Haas.
That this hyping of the possibility of a war, a real full-fledged war between China and Taiwan is not stabilizing the situation, and that it adds or fuels this, what China is trying to do anyway, which is creating sort of a sense of doom in Taiwan, in the society, that, this sort of fatalism, we are at the receiving end anyway, and we have no chance of surviving. And this would be really bad. And so we should focus more on the positive enmeshment of Taiwan in other contexts, instead of hyping this danger of a military attack of China. So I think this sense of doom is something that we should all try to, help not to come about. And this brings me to the disinformation question. As far as I know, and Mathieu was part of the group when we were in Taiwan the last time, we visited some institutions that do exactly that. They try to educate the public in Taiwan about disinformation, the way these fake news are sort of put into the social media, how to recognize them. So media literacy education is very important, and I think that Taiwan makes a lot of efforts there. But I would add that this is also an area where Taiwan has a lot to offer in terms of information to other countries that are, targets of Chinese disinformation, and where we could intensify the exchange. This is exactly one of the issues that is taking place within this global framework, because Taiwan has a lot of information to offer there. They will not disclose every attack and every move that China makes, because they don't want China to know that they know. But I think that we would really benefit from that. I think I'll leave it at that. I took up most of it. Maybe one small remark on what you said, Reinhard, about Lithuania, was it?
Yeah.
I mean, one is how you name the Taiwan representative office in your country. And the other is opening offices, but many European countries, we have to say that, do have an office in Taiwan and are represented there. Taiwan has, I think, 4 offices in Germany and 3 or so in France. So it's not a matter of opening an office. It's also whether you insist on a certain naming, how low key you are about it. And this is, I think that the Baltic states are moving in a direction that is probably, Germany will not take that up. Let's put it this way.
Thank you.
It's getting dark here. I have to turn the light on.
Thank you, Gudrun. We're in our final round, and I will give Mathieu and Sven Biskup an opportunity to also comment on how they see the mood developing in Taiwan as far as you have your own experience. But there have been a few more additional questions, and I would also want to put them to you. And once I get back to you, we will then sort of round it up. So, for instance, from Yannick, there is a question under the title "Positive Enmeshment." What's the status of student exchanges during high school and undergraduate studies with Taiwan, and what's the potential of increasing them? And then I will we'll get back to the question of the investment agreement. I would like to mention that EPP Group in their most recent China strategy explicitly advocated having an investment agreement with Taiwan, similar to what had been proposed in the 2015 Trade for All strategy that has been renounced recently by Commission. And we had been discussing about whether it might not be helpful to at least start a scoping exercise. But as I have understood now, the argument, and please contradict me, and that would be interesting, the argument has been more or less that it might be more pertinent to include Taiwan in a multilateral effort at building reliable supply chains among like-minded countries and entities, instead of now putting the focus exclusively on an investment deal. So please contradict if you think that's not a fair strategic assessment. And then the last point that Jana raised from Borderlex is this. What is the scope for transatlantic cooperation on Taiwan with the new administration in Washington? And somebody, Sven already commented on what Gudrun said, saying China is signaling threatening to amplify their signal even more. I think that's a very smart stance. So Gudrun, if it's okay with you, I will start with you. So in particular, transatlantic scope, maybe, and the other question, any remarks you have left there?
Okay, I'm sorry, there is a big storm going on here, and I don't know whether the internet will break down or what is going on. It's like all hell is breaking loose here in Berlin. On the transatlantic potential, I think we're in the early stages, and the priority is probably to look at China. I mean, of course, this is related to Taiwan, but I think that we have to figure out first where we are on the same page and where we are not. And there are issues where the Europeans are not on the same page. And also, I think the US or the new administration might underestimate the damage that has been done by the previous administration and the concerns that we have in Europe that 4 years from now, we will be back to square one. So as welcome as, you know, all these offers and extended hand from the US side is, I think there is a certain degree of caution. But on Taiwan, I think Bonnie made a few suggestions where there could be a stronger coordination. One is the statements within, you know, D10, G7, whatever. I think there are some good examples also where France, the UK, Germany, at the UN level, you know, made a statement on the South China Sea. So we should try to include Taiwan in statements like that. I'm not saying about the South China Sea. I'm saying, you know, addressing this gray zone activities and stuff like that, and making our position clear on what we think of unilaterally changing the status quo without the consent of the other side. So there I see possibilities. Whether this is on top of the agenda of talking to the Biden administration, I'm not sure, I'm not in the room. But as I said, we're in the early days, and I think there are some more pressing topics probably to talk about with respect to China, and figure out what we can do together there with or against China. I'm not sure. I mean, this is one of the issues we have to figure out. I think there is a lot of room for the Europeans to do things. Maybe one useful exercise on our side would be to take stock of what the individual member states, what kind of relations they have with Taiwan, because this is very different from country to country. And, you know, start from there before we can, figure out what is possible in transatlantic relations.
Thank you. Mathieu.
Thanks. I will first try to answer the question about the mood. And I was really struck when I visited Taiwan in 2019 and in 2020 to find, you know, much more optimism in the Taiwanese society than I had been used to in previous years. And I think it's, you know, linked to two elements. I think the first is that for many years in Taiwan, there has been, you know, this impression that Taiwan's international space was in fact shrinking as Taiwanese allies were being, you know, turned by China, and that Taiwan was suffering mainly setbacks on the international scene. And I think that to some extent, the supply chain restructuring discussion that was first started not by the COVID crisis, but by the policies of the Trump administration, have had a very positive effect on the mood in Taiwan. And some of the, you know, very salient issues in US-Taiwan relations, in US-China relations, have in fact opened up some space for Taiwan. I'm thinking, for example, of the global discussion regarding 5G and Huawei, which in 2019 was very much taken, you know, as an opportunity by many actors in the Taiwanese electronics industry and the ICT industry. And this creates, in fact, space for Taiwan. But what has also completely changed compared to previous years, in linked to this discussion on supply chains restructuring, is the fact that you know, the reshoring program of the Taiwanese government, bringing back Taiwanese companies to Taiwan, and the policy supporting diversification of investments towards South and Southeast Asia, which had been the Taiwanese idea since the early 90s, in reality, since Taiwan has become, you know, an investor in mainland China, and since trade and investment relations have taken off, there has always been this strategic thinking that Taiwan should diversify and reshore, but it never worked because the attractivity of China was always too strong, and suddenly this completely changes the dynamic. And you know, my qualitative indicators as a visitor, people I spoke to, media coverage in Taiwan, etc., really kind of suggested a sense of optimism. And then the COVID-19 and the success of Taiwan also, you know, was a very positive development for a society to prove to itself that it was highly, highly competitive. But then, I mean, we are in April 2021 now, and you know, I'm wondering the extent to which the Air Force campaign in Taiwan's air defense identification zone and the military pressure, which is back on the agenda in the Taiwan Strait, is affecting the mood. It's a little bit hard to measure because moods change, and I'm not there, but I noticed a very interesting poll, in fact, published very recently, and it comes from the Blue Camp. It comes from the think tank of the Kuomintang, the National Policy Foundation, which found that 60% of the Taiwanese believe that a war between China and Taiwan is unlikely or impossible, and that only 5% thought it was very likely, and 17% thought it was fairly possible. You know, this is my response to Gudrun's points regarding the excellent piece published by Ryan Haas and his colleagues regarding hyping the risk of war in the Taiwan Strait. My impression being in Taiwan last September 2020, and there were already operations in the ADIZ and crossing the median line, was that people's heads were still quite cool with regards to the risks, and so that mainly as you know, signaling, but putting pressure. And so, you know, you could almost argue, if you put the two elements that I just mentioned together, that the PLA Air Force intimidation campaign is about kind of putting a stop to that positive trend in the mood in the Taiwanese society. I think it's a possibility indeed.
Thank you. Sven.
Yes, I didn't pick up the question on the mood in Taiwan since I didn't want to be presumptuous and pretend that I can know that. But certainly, I mean, I got worried myself when I saw that American admiral saying, oh, the chance of war was almost imminent if you listen to that guy. And I'm thinking, I'm beginning to think in a way, you know, admirals in general should stay out of politics. But when I asked my husband how is this covered in Taiwan, and what is perception, it's what Mathieu just said, that the feeling is more like, yeah, well, these Chinese incursions were to be expected. There's a new US administration. Beijing is signaling, let's not attach too much importance to it. And so we should probably not, as I said, play into Chinese cards by amplifying that. The reverse, or say to some extent the reverse is also true. Taiwan has been very successful now. We in Europe have been the opposite of successful. And I think also everywhere in Asia, it's a great somehow disillusion or a great amazement how totally ineffective these supposedly well-governed democracies are. And I think in all of our policies also this will have great impact, that our moral authority to pretend that we know better has greatly decreased in large parts of the world, but I would say particularly in Asia. And I mean, we'll have to see how this plays out, but to this day, my feeling is we should not underestimate this, how our image has been so much weakened by this. And finally, on the transatlantic issue, indeed, once again agree with Gudrun. I think, you know, if you look at the American elections, we must be prepared for the situation in which in 4 years' time we get, Trump or another Trump or a Trump-like person in the White House again. And so now is not the time to say, oh, now we can safely follow Washington's lead again. We should definitely stick to the EU objective of strategic autonomy in all fields of policy, meaning that we arrive at our own conclusions. Of course, those can be the same conclusions that the US arrives at, but we should arrive at them first based on our priorities and interests, and then coordinate with United States.
Strategic autonomy.
Sorry. Now we have lost the moderator, it seems. I don't know if that puts me in charge since I happen to have the floor. I had anyway concluded, so thank you for that.
Sven, are you?
You were gone.
See you again.
We were all here. Just
So there was. Sorry, Gudrun, what do you say?
I said we were all here. Just you had gone.
Oh, I had been lost. So if everybody heard your last sentence, Sven, please repeat it for me.
Oh, I just said that, yeah, we should stick to our objective of strategic autonomy in diplomacy, defense, and the economy, which means that, in my view, we arrive at our own conclusions based on our priorities and interests. And then we coordinate with US. And of course, often those will be the same conclusions at the US, but we should arrive at them first, and not the other way around. Thank you.
Thank you. I want to thank all four of the experts for excellent insights and very lively discussion. I thought this was a great opportunity for many of us who are not so knowledgeable about Taiwan to learn a lot. I learned. I'm very grateful, and I would just want to sum up by mentioning a few points that I have noted. First of all, I think that we should do some more homework, as Gudrun has said, look at where exactly we do stand with regard to Taiwan, because it's been under the radar screen for too long, and we might want to know better where to start from. I certainly think that we should devise our own policies, as Sven just emphasized, and we should, and I repeat what was said at the very beginning, we should do Taiwan policy for Taiwan's sake and for the sake of democracy, and not to attack China or to create tensions. One thing that we have not addressed a lot is the dimension of people-to-people relations. It was mentioned in the end in the chat by somebody, and certainly this would also merit more discussion. There are some relationships that have not been fully exploited. For instance, I know we have a small Green Party in Taiwan. We could possibly enhance collaboration with them. In the electoral platform of my party for the upcoming federal elections, we do mention Taiwan and take the position that the status quo should not be changed against the will of the people of Taiwan. So I think there would be a scope for giving more attention to that. I think that there is a need to have more visibility for the interaction with Taiwan, even though, as Bonnie said, some of the things might qualify more for that approach than others. And the one thing that I have concluded from all your contributions is that we should strive to make Taiwan as much part of multilateral efforts as we can. So prioritizing multilateral involvement of Taiwan over just bilateral involvement. So including Taiwan in supply chain strategizing, include Taiwan in international organizations. I would say that indeed this is a perfect moment, because even though the number of diplomatic allies of Taiwan has shrunk over the last years, I get the impression, and I think you said that, Mathieu, that the political space for Taiwan has been widening, and I think we should take advantage of that. So with that, let me conclude. Let me wish you all a good afternoon or a good night or a good evening. And I'm very happy that you took the time out to join us here. I want to thank you again, and hope to see you again soon in a similar or even broader contexts. Thank you, Gudrun. Thank you, Sven. Thank you, Mathieu. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.